The silence was the worst part. In a fighter cockpit, noise is life. The roar of a 12-cylinder engine is the heartbeat of the aircraft, a constant, deafening reassure that you are moving, fighting, and alive. When that noise stops, the world shrinks down to a terrifying set of mathematical variables: altitude, airspeed, and the unforgiving hardness of the Earth rising to meet you. On the afternoon of November 2, 1944, somewhere over the frozen, jagged landscape of Czechoslovakia, First Lieutenant Bruce Carr heard the sound of his own death. It wasn't an explosion. It was the sickening, grinding screech of metal fusing together, followed by an absolute, hollow silence. The Rolls-Royce Merlin engine of his P-51 Mustang, starved of oil by a jagged piece of German flak, had seized solid. One moment, he was the predator, a master of the sky leading a strafing run against a Luftwaffe airfield. The next, he was falling inside a 4-ton aluminum coffin. The propeller, once a blur of motion pulling him through the air at 400 miles per hour, was now a stationary, 4-bladed anchor dragging him down. Carr checked his altimeter. The needle was unwinding fast. He had seconds, not minutes, to make the only decision that mattered. He didn't panic. Panic was a luxury for men on the ground. Instead, he pulled the canopy release, rolled the dying Mustang inverted, and let gravity take him. As he tumbled into the freezing slipstream, Bruce Carr was falling toward a fate that statistics said was inevitable. The survival rate for American pilots shot down this deep behind enemy lines was abysmal. If the fall didn't kill him, the landing would. If the landing didn't kill him, the exposure would. And if he survived the cold, the Germans were waiting. Thousands of Wehrmacht troops, SS patrols, and Gestapo agents infested the region. Yet, as his silk chute snapped open, jerking him violently against his harness, Carr could not have known that he was embarking on one of the most audacious survival stories of the Second World War. He was about to prove that the difference between a prisoner of war and a legend is simply the refusal to accept the impossible. But to understand why a 20-year-old man would eventually choose to do the insane rather than the sensible, you have to look back at the boy who fell in love with the sky long before the world caught fire. Bruce Ward Carr was born in Union Springs, New York, in the dead of winter 1924. He was a child of the Depression, growing up in an era where resourcefulness wasn't a character trait but a survival skill. There was nothing particularly martial about his upbringing, no family lineage of great warriors, but there was a spark of restlessness in him that the quiet life of upstate New York couldn't extinguish. That spark found its fuel in 1939. While Europe was crumbling under the tread of panzer divisions and the invasion of Poland was plunging the globe into darkness, a 15-year-old Carr was standing on the edge of a grass airstrip, staring at a beat-up biplane. A local crop duster named Earl had offered the kid a ride and, perhaps, a chance to touch the controls. For most boys, it would have been a thrill. For Carr, it was a religious awakening. The moment the wheels left the grass, the moment the horizon tilted and the world became a map below him, he knew he would never be truly happy on the ground again. By the time he was 16, he had logged more flight time than many of the military cadets who would soon be rushing to recruitment centers. He didn't learn to fly by reading manuals or sitting in classrooms. He learned by feeling the wind on the fabric wings, by listening to the pitch of the engine, by sensing the air as if it were a physical extension of his own body. When America finally entered the war, Carr didn't wait to be drafted. He enlisted in the Army Air Forces in September 1942 at the age of 18. The military bureaucracy, usually a slow-moving beast, took one look at his logbook and realized they didn't need to teach this kid how to fly. They just needed to teach him how to kill. His accelerated training was a blur of high-performance machinery and gunnery practice. By early 1944, he was in England, strapped into the cockpit of the P-51 Mustang. To a pilot like Carr, the Mustang was more than a machine, It was the apex of aeronautical engineering. It was a weapon of elegant brutality, with a range that allowed it to escort bombers all the way to Berlin and back, and a top speed that pushed past 430 miles per hour. It was the first Allied fighter that could truly hunt the Luftwaffe on its own terms. Carr named his plane Angel's Playmate, a moniker that hinted at both the divine protection he hoped for and the dangerous game he was playing. Combat revealed something about Carr that flight training hadn't. He was aggressive. Not just brave, but relentlessly, terrifyingly aggressive. While some pilots flew to survive, Carr flew to hunt. This mindset nearly ended his career before it truly began. On March 8, 1944, during his first real engagement, he spotted a German Messerschmitt Bf 109. The enemy pilot, realizing he was outmatched, dove for the deck, skimming the treetops in a desperate attempt to shake the American. Standard procedure dictated that Carr should break off. Chasing a bandit at treetop level was suicide. The margin for error was non-existent. But Carr didn't pull up. He pushed the throttle forward. For 40 miles he chased the German through the forest, his Mustang's belly nearly scraping the pine needles, flying at speeds that blurred the world into a tunnel of green and gray. He fired, missed, adjusted, and fired again. A burst from his .50 caliber machine guns clipped the German's wing. The panic-stricken enemy pilot tried to bail out too low, crashing into a hillside. When Carr returned to base, exhilarated and expecting a pat on the back, his commanding officer tore a strip off him. He was told he was reckless, that he had nearly thrown away a valuable aircraft and his own life for a kill that technically didn't even count because the enemy had crashed rather than been shot down. He was transferred to the 354th Fighter Group, the Pioneer Mustang Group. It was meant to be a punishment, or at least a corrective measure. Instead, it placed him among the elite. The 354th was a unit of killers, the first to fly the Mustang in combat, and Carr fit in perfectly. Through the summer and autumn of 1944, as the Allies pushed across France and toward the German border, Carr began to rack up victories. He didn't just shoot down planes, he protected his wingmen with a ferocity that earned him the Silver Star. He became an ace, destroying 5 enemy aircraft in aerial combat, including 3 Focke-Wulf 190s in a single engagement in September. He was invincible. He was 20 years old, flying the best plane in the world, and he felt like he would live forever. Then came November 2nd. The flak shell that severed his oil line didn't care about his kill count or his skill. It was a random, jagged piece of metal that turned his P-51 into a glider over Czechoslovakia. The landing was brutal. Carr hit the frozen ground hard, the impact sending a shockwave of pain through his leg. He rolled, instinctively collapsing the parachute to prevent the wind from dragging him, but the damage was done. His ankle was twisted, swollen, and throbbing with a dull, nauseating ache. He lay there for a moment in the dead leaves, listening. The forest was silent. No sirens, no shouting German voices. Not yet. He checked his watch. It was late afternoon. The temperature was already dropping, the biting cold of Central Europe seeping through his flight suit. He had a .45 caliber pistol, a few rounds of ammunition, and no food. He was 200 miles behind enemy lines. The logic of evasion told him to head south or west, away from the airfield he had just attacked, toward the distant hope of Allied lines. But Carr knew that the German patrols would be sweeping the perimeter, looking for a pilot running away from the target. So he did the unexpected. He turned north, limping directly toward the enemy airfield. For 4 days, Bruce Carr existed in a state of primal misery. He moved only at night, navigating by the stars and the contour of the land, dragging his injured leg through the underbrush. The hunger was a physical weight, a gnawing emptiness that made his hands shake and his vision swim. He drank from freezing streams, the water numbing his throat, but doing nothing to stop the calorie deficit that was slowly killing him. On the second day, he lay motionless in a ditch for 2 hours as a German patrol walked past, so close he could smell the tobacco smoke from their cigarettes and hear the leather of their boots creaking. He held his breath until his lungs burned, his hand gripping the cold steel of his pistol, knowing that if they saw him, he would empty the magazine and save the last round for himself. He didn't want to be captured. He had heard the stories. But by the fourth day, the resolve was breaking. His body was consuming itself. The cold was a constant, agonizing presence. He was hallucinating, his mind drifting back to New York, to the smell of his mother's cooking, to the warmth of a bed. He realized he was going to die. Not in a glorious dogfight, but shivering in a ditch, starved and forgotten. The pragmatism that made him a great pilot took over. Surrender was better than death. The Luftwaffe generally treated captured aviators with a degree of professional respect, unlike the SS. He would walk in, hands up, and spend the rest of the war in a prison camp. It was a bitter pill to swallow, but it was the only card he had left to play. On the evening of the fourth day, Carr reached the edge of the forest overlooking the airfield he had tried to destroy. He positioned himself in a tree line, shivering violently, waiting for dawn. He would surrender in the morning light, or he was less likely to be shot by a jumpy sentry. Through the screen of pine branches, he watched the enemy base. It was active. Mechanics moved back and forth in the twilight. Trucks rumbled along the perimeter. It was a hive of the German war machine. As the sun dipped below the horizon, casting long, purple shadows across the tarmac, Carr's eyes locked onto something near the edge of the runway, about 80 yards from his hiding spot. It was a revetment, a U-shaped earthen berm designed to protect parked aircraft from blast damage. Inside sat a Focke-Wulf 190, the butcher bird. Even sitting static on the ground, it looked predatory. It was painted in the mottled grays and greens of Luftwaffe camouflage, the black crosses stark against the fuselage. Carr watched as 2 mechanics worked on the fighter. They were thorough, methodical. Under the harsh glare of portable electric lights, he saw them hook up a fuel hose. They filled the tanks to the brim. They checked the oil. They climbed onto the wing and reached into the cockpit. Then, the sound of an engine turning over shattered the evening quiet. A cough, a sputter, and then the deep, throaty roar of the BMW 801 radial engine coming to life. They were running a pre-flight check. Carr watched, mesmerized. He saw the control surfaces move, ailerons flapping, rudder kicking left and right. They revved the engine, the prop wash kicking up a cloud of dust, the blue exhaust flames licking from the cowling. The engine sounded healthy, powerful. After 10 minutes, they cut the throttle. The propeller spun down to a halt. The mechanics climbed down, placed chocks under the wheels, covered the canopy with a tarp, and walked away toward the warmth of the hangars. They left no guard. Bruce Carr sat in the snow, his eyes fixed on the silent, fueled, fully operational fighter plane. The plan to surrender began to dissolve, replaced by a thought so reckless, so impossibly dangerous, that it made chasing a Messerschmitt through the trees look like a Sunday drive. He looked at the distance, 80 yards of open ground. He looked at the guard towers in the distance. He looked at the plane. He had never sat in a German cockpit. He couldn't read a word of German. He didn't know how to start the engine, how to lower the flaps, or how to operate the radio. But he knew the universal language of flight. A stick was a stick. A throttle was a throttle. If he could get inside that cockpit without being shot, and if he could figure out how to wake the machine up, he wouldn't have to surrender. He wouldn't have to die in the snow. The hours ticked by. Carr waited for the dead of night, for the shift change, for the deepest silence. At 3 a.m., the airfield was a ghost town. The moon was obscured by clouds, plunging the runway into darkness. This was it. He checked his ankle. It was stiff, painful, but it would hold. He took a breath of the freezing air, steeling himself. He stood up from his hiding spot, leaving the safety of the trees, and stepped out onto the open ground. There was no going back. He moved as fast as his injured leg would allow, a shadow moving among shadows, crouching low, his eyes darting toward the guard towers. 80 yards. 60. 40. He expected a spotlight to blind him, a rifle shot to crack the silence. Nothing. He reached the wing of the FW-190. It loomed above him, massive and cold. He scrambled up onto the root of the wing, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. He slid the canopy back. It was unlocked. Carr dropped into the seat. It was tight, cramped, smelling of oil, leather, and stale German tobacco. He pulled the canopy shut over his head, sealing himself inside the belly of the beast. He was alone in the cockpit of one of the deadliest fighters ever built, surrounded by darkness and enemy soldiers. He reached out and touched the instrument panel. He couldn't see a thing. He fumbled in his pocket and pulled out a matchbook. He struck a match, cupping the flame to hide the light. The flare of the match illuminated the panel for a fleeting second. It was a nightmare. Gothic script, unfamiliar dials, dozens of switches. Somewhere in this confusing mess of German engineering was the switch that would start the engine. Somewhere was the lever that would set him free. And somewhere outside, the Germans were sleeping, unaware that an American ghost was sitting in their plane, about to steal their pride and joy. The match burned down to his fingertips. He shook it out. Darkness returned. Bruce Carr took a deep breath, reached into the dark, and began to feel for the switch that would either save his life or kill him. The cockpit of the Focke-Wulf 190 was a claustrophobic tomb of cold metal and incomprehensible labels. Bruce Carr sat in the darkness, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, forcing his breathing to slow down. He struck another match, the small flame flaring up to reveal the instrument panel for a few precious seconds. He wasn't looking for the radio or the weapon systems. He was looking for the heart of the machine. On the right side of the cockpit, he found a T-shaped handle. The German text beside it was unintelligible, but the mechanics of aviation are universal. It looked like a starter pull. In a P-51 Mustang, the starter is an electrical switch that engages immediately. The German engineering was different. Carr gripped the handle and pulled. Nothing happened. He pushed it. Still nothing. He paused, wiping sweat from his forehead despite the freezing temperature. He pulled it again, harder this time, and held it. A sound began to fill the cockpit, a low, rising whine, like a siren winding up. It was an inertia starter. He wasn't cranking the engine directly. He was spinning up a heavy flywheel, storing kinetic energy that would eventually be dumped into the cylinders to turn the massive prop. The noise grew louder, a mechanical scream that cut through the silence of the sleeping airfield. Every German sentry within a mile would hear it. The element of surprise was gone. It was now a race against the bullets. Carr let the flywheel spin for 10 agonizing seconds, the whine reaching a fever pitch, and then he engaged the clutch. The BMW 801 radial engine caught with a thunderous, cough-like explosion. Blue flames spat from the exhaust stacks, licking the darkness, and the propeller blurred into a lethal arc. The aircraft shook violently as 1,700 horsepower roared to life. Carr didn't wait for the engine to warm up. He didn't check the oil pressure. He didn't look for the runway. He slammed the throttle forward to the stops. The Focke-Wulf lurched forward, straining against the chocks the mechanics had left under the wheels. With a groan of metal, the aircraft jumped the chocks and surged onto the grass. Outside, the airfield was waking up. Floodlights snapped on. Figures ran from the barracks, shouting, pointing at the rogue fighter tearing across the tarmac. Carr couldn't see them. His world was the narrow view through the armored glass windscreen. He was gathering speed, but not on a runway. He was careening across the grass, bouncing violently, heading straight for the gap between two hangars. 60 miles per hour. 80. The tail of the FW-190, notoriously heavy, refused to lift. He jammed the stick forward to get the tail up, then hauled back hard as the hangars rushed to fill his vision. The aircraft shuddered and leaped into the air, the landing gear wheels missing the roof of the barracks by mere feet. He was airborne. He was flying a stolen enemy fighter at night with no lights, no radio, and no idea where the landing gear retraction lever was. The relief of being in the air was instantly replaced by the terror of the flight. Carr was now a target for everyone. To the Germans below, he was a thief stealing a valuable war asset. To the Allies waiting in France, he was a Luftwaffe attacker. He kept the aircraft low, skimming the treetops at 300 miles per hour to stay under the radar net. The dark forest rushed beneath him, a blur of shadows. Inside the cockpit, he began the desperate process of trial and error. He found a lever on the left side and pulled it. A heavy clunk reverberated through the airframe, and the drag reduced. The landing gear had retracted. One problem solved. He found the trim tabs and stabilized the flight. Now, navigation. He located the compass, orienting himself west-southwest. France. Home. For 30 minutes, Bruce Carr flew the flight of his life. As the sun began to bleed over the horizon behind him, the landscape changed from the forests of Czechoslovakia to the cratered fields of the Western Front. He crossed the lines near daybreak, and that was when the real nightmare began. As he roared over the American sector, the ground erupted. Allied anti-aircraft crews, seeing the distinct silhouette of a Focke-Wulf 190, the butcher bird that had harried them for years, opened fire with everything they had. Tracers arced toward him, green and red lines of death reaching for his cockpit. Infantrymen raised their rifles and fired potshots. Carr was flying inside a kill box created by his own side. He couldn't radio down to tell them to stop. He couldn't wave. He could only fly lower, faster, hugging the terrain so tightly that the gunners couldn't track him. He later said it felt like every .50 caliber machine gun in France was trying to kill him personally. The airfield of the 354th Fighter Group appeared ahead, strip A66 near Orcante, France. It was his home base. He banked the stolen fighter toward the runway, cutting the throttle. The anti-aircraft batteries surrounding the field tracked him, barrels swiveling. They held fire, perhaps confused by the audacity of a lone German plane approaching in broad daylight with its gear up. And the gear was indeed up. Carr pulled the lever he had used earlier. Nothing happened. He pumped it. Zero response. He frantically searched the cockpit for a backup system, an emergency hand pump, anything. He didn't know that the FW-190 required the pilot to set a hydraulic selector valve to extend before the lever would work. It was a simple switch, but in a cockpit labeled in German, it might as well have been a riddle written in hieroglyphics. He was out of time. He couldn't circle. The AA guns would blow him out of the sky. He had to put it on the ground now. He lined up parallel to the main runway, aiming for the grass. He cut the engine. The silence returned, rushing in with the wind noise. The heavy fighter sank like a stone. Carr braced himself, locking his arms against the glare shield. The belly of the FW-190 hit the French mud at 100 miles per hour. The sound was deafening, metal tearing, dirt spraying, the propeller blades curling back as they struck the earth. The aircraft slid for 300 yards, a sled of uncontrolled momentum, before grinding to a violent, shuddering halt in a cloud of dust and steam. Before the dust had even settled, the wreck was surrounded. Military police jeeps skidded to a halt, and GIs bailed out, M1 Garand rifles raised, shouting for the Kraut to come out with his hands up. They were expecting a defecting German officer, or perhaps a fanatic ready to throw a grenade. The canopy slide rail was jammed. Carr slammed his shoulder against it, forcing it open with a screech of metal. He climbed out onto the wing, a vision of misery. He was unshaven, starving, covered in mud and oil, wearing a tattered American flight suit. He looked down at the ring of rifle barrels pointed at his chest. "I'm Captain Carr," he croaked, his voice raspy from dehydration. "I'm with this goddamn squadron." The MPs stared. The face was familiar, but the context was impossible. Carr had been missing for days, presumed dead. He was a ghost. A staff car pulled up, pushing through the crowd. Colonel George Bickle, the group commander, stepped out. He looked at the smoking German fighter. He looked at the pilot standing on the wing. He looked at the stunned MPs. Bickle didn't salute. He just shook his head, a mixture of disbelief and awe on his face. "Carr," he said, delivering a line that would be repeated in officers' clubs for decades. "Where in the hell have you been? And what have you been doing now?" Bruce Carr was given a hero's welcome, a hot meal, and a few days of rest. Most men would have taken a rotation home. They would have sold the story to the newspapers and sat out the rest of the war on a Bond tour. Carr was back in the cockpit of a P-51 Mustang within the week. He wasn't done. The theft of the FW-190 had proved his survival instincts, but he wanted to prove his lethality. 5 months later, on April 2, 1945, he got his chance. Leading a flight of 4 Mustangs on a reconnaissance sweep near Schweinfurt, Carr spotted a massive formation of German fighters above him. It was a mixed group of Bf-109s and FW-190s, more than 60 aircraft in total. The odds were 15-1. The Germans had the altitude and the numbers. Standard doctrine screamed for evasion. Carr keyed his mic and said one word: "Engaging." He pulled his Mustang into a vertical climb, driving straight into the heart of the enemy swarm. The Germans, likely complacent due to their overwhelming numbers, were caught completely off guard. Carr didn't just survive the dogfight, he dominated it. In a whirlwind of violence lasting less than 10 minutes, he personally shot down 3 FW-190s and 2 Bf-109s. 5 confirmed kills in a single mission. He became an ace in a day, one of the rarest distinctions in aerial combat. His flight of 4 destroyed 15 enemy aircraft without a single loss. It was a masterclass in aggression, proving that the pilot who had stolen a plane to get home was arguably the most dangerous man in the European theater. The war ended, but Bruce Carr's war did not. He stayed in the newly formed United States Air Force, trading propellers for jet engines. He flew combat missions in Korea in the F-86 Sabre, tangling with MiGs over MiG Alley. He rose to the rank of colonel. When Vietnam erupted, he went there too, flying the F-100 Super Sabre on close air support missions, dragging bombs through the humid jungle air to support troops on the ground. By the time he finally hung up his flight suit in 1973, he had flown 505 combat missions across 3 wars. He had ejected, crashed, and been shot up more times than he cared to count. But the story of the stolen fighter followed him. It was the legend that defined him, even if he rarely spoke of it. In 1997, a year before he passed away from cancer, the aviation world gave him one final salute. The Fantasy of Flight Museum in Florida invited the 73-year-old colonel to fly a P-51 Mustang for an airshow crowd. There were whispers that perhaps he was too old, that the high-performance fighter was too much for a man in his 70s. Carr climbed into the cockpit, the muscle memory of 1944 taking over. He didn't just fly the plane, he unleashed it. He roared over the runway at 300 knots, 50 feet off the deck, pulling into vertical loops and barrel rolls that pinned him to his seat with G-forces that would have blacked out men half his age. When he taxied back in, the engine crackling as it cooled, he had a grin on his face that hadn't changed since he was a teenager on a crop duster's strip. Bruce Ward Carr died on April 25, 1998. He rests in Arlington National Cemetery, surrounded by the honored dead of a nation he served for 3 decades. His headstone lists his rank and his wars. It mentions the Distinguished Service Cross and the Silver Star. But it cannot capture the sheer, audacious spirit of a man who stood in a snowy forest in 1944, looked at an enemy machine of war, and decided that the only way home was to take it. His legacy teaches a lesson that transcends aviation. When the odds are impossible and the path forward seems blocked, you don't surrender. You climb into the cockpit, you light a match in the dark, and you fly the damn plane yourself.